Okay, well, we have quite a few people here in the audience, so I think we'll go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, I'm Dr. Ruth Norman, and it's been my great pleasure to work with Deborah Abrams on her dissertation, along with having Dr. Guillermina Gonzalez on the dissertation committee. And Dr. Gonzalez was wonderful. Bringing her international background was very helpful to have that perspective. The way the defense process works is Debbie will have 45 minutes to go through her presentation. At the end of that time, we will open up the floor for faculty discussions, and then we'll open up the floor for any comments or questions anyone in the audience happens to have. We also ask that during the presentation, you turn off your camera and silence your microphone. And without further ado, I will hand over the floor to Deborah Abrams.
All right, thank you very much. So good afternoon for most of you, good morning still for a few of you. I'm Debbie Abrams, and like many study topics, my title is a mouthful. So my topic is Mount San Jacinto College Hispanic students' perceptions of how their teachers' equity-oriented practices impact their success. So what this means is getting the Hispanic students' opinions on whether or not their teachers' practices help or harm them. So I'm a teacher at MSJC, which is a community college in Southern California. I work in the adult education department, and I teach a lot of Hispanic students every semester. As the state of California attempts to improve outcomes for Hispanic students and other minorities, the topic of how to achieve those results is getting more and more attention. So I always strive to make sure that my students get what they need to be successful. But with all of the studies out there on equitable teaching methods, there are a lot of conflicting recommendations and insufficient studies on what the students feel are helpful to them. So I wanted to sit down with Hispanic students and ask them questions, and that's what this study was all about. So these are the topics I'll be covering today. First, I'll do an introduction to my topic, then an overview of the literature review, followed by my study methodology, a brief discussion of the results, and finally, I'll conclude with the highlights of the study. So let's start with an introduction of my topic. These are some of the key terms that will be used throughout this presentation, and they're important for understanding our discussion. So classroom practices represent all of the decisions a teacher makes about how they'll conduct their class. One way I described this to the study's participants was that it's what makes one teacher's class different from another. Collaborative learning is when students work together in teams or groups. The idea is for students to help each other learn. Culturally responsive teaching is using students' cultural backgrounds and experiences along with their preferred method of learning to help them relate to and understand the material. So equity is a much harder concept. Of all the words in my defense, it's probably the least understood. I'm using the definition in the MSJC Equity Pledge, and it's an attempt to provide individual students with the tools they need to be successful. The goal is to make sure everyone has the same chance of success by identifying and removing unfair barriers. This study uses the term Hispanic for its student participants. The difference between Hispanic and Latino is that the term Latino includes people from Brazil and other non-Spanish speaking South and Central American countries. The California Community College system uses the term Hispanic, so I chose Hispanic as my demographic for this study as well. Hispanic serving institutions, or HSIs, are not-for-profit colleges and universities that have at least 25% Hispanic student populations and have applied for HSI status with the federal government. And MSJC has been an HSI for the past 23 years. Scaffolding is when teachers give extra support to students when they're still learning new concepts. And then that help is gradually removed as they become more independent and understand and can demonstrate the concepts that they've learned. So the California Community College, or from here on out, I'll call it the CCC. This system is the largest single education system in the United States, serving 1.8 million students throughout the state. As you can see with the CCC in blue and MSJC in red, MSJC's Hispanic population is higher than the state average. And at over 52%, the MSJC Hispanic student population is much larger than any other ethnic group. The importance of the research comes from its focus on this large number of Hispanic students at MSJC. It addresses critical issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and focuses on identifying what Hispanic students say helps them succeed in their classes. Most importantly, the study provides valuable feedback on equity-oriented classroom practices, enabling MSJC professors to adapt their teaching methods to better meet those diverse needs of their students. So California has integrated equity requirements into higher education standards through the California Code of Regulations, the California Education Code, and the accreditation process itself. In 2017, the CCC Chancellor announced his vision for success to reduce equity gaps for minority students. The original vision for success was to end in 2027, but the districts really weren't making satisfactory progress even prior to COVID. And then the COVID pandemic resulted in a significant drop in Hispanic and other minority enrollments for a few years. In 2021, the governor presented his roadmap for equity, but this roadmap built on the vision for success and kept that original goal still by 2027. But by 2023, the new CCC chancellor established Vision 2030 once it was clear the schools were not going to meet that 2027 goal. The new plan provides a more flexible approach and has a new deadline, of course, of 2030, which is where that name comes from. The regional completion goals show that the poorer districts, especially the Inland Empire, have to improve the most in order to reach that goal. In this chart, the dark blue part of the bar is the 2017 baseline for completion rates. The lighter blue portion are the gains made 1 year later, and the yellow is the amount required to reach the 30% state goal. MSJC is one of the larger districts in the Inland Empire, and its student completion rate lags behind those of their contemporaries in other higher performing regions. 60% of CCCs outperform MSJC in completion rates. MSJC lacks insight into how students perceive their professors' equity-oriented classroom practices. Despite professors' intentions to use fair and equitable methods, there's an understanding gap for the impact on diverse student groups. Existing research mainly focuses on faculty training and higher education equity theories, rather than on students' experiences and perceptions of inclusion. And this study attempts to bridge that gap by identifying both instructors' practices and their Hispanic students' views, which should hopefully ultimately help MSJC to identify the most beneficial classroom practices for their student success. So my study asked 3 research questions. The first is, what classroom practices are perceived by MSJC faculty to positively influence Hispanic student success? The purpose of this question is to identify what practices teachers are using to improve equitable results. The second question is, what classroom practices are perceived by MSJC Hispanic students to positively or negatively influence their success? And the purpose of this question is to identify how Hispanic students feel about the practices their teachers have chosen and whether they feel those practices have a positive or negative impact on their success. And finally, the third question is, how do MSJC faculty's and Hispanic students' perceptions of equitable classroom practices align or not align? And this involved comparing the teacher's answers to each of their students to see if the practices the teacher specifically chose to improve results aligned with what the student said helped them or hurt them. I didn't include any propositions because I was open to what the findings would be without preconceived ideas of what the students would say or where they would agree or disagree with their teacher's practices. So the literature review for this topic was vast since it attempted to find all of the classroom practices believed to be the most helpful for Hispanic students. And because classroom practices are defined as all the different decisions a teacher can make for their class, you can imagine how many topics there can be. So I attempted to limit the review to the practices identified as being particularly beneficial for Hispanic students or for underrepresented students in general. I also attempted to focus on community college students, only expanding to four-year colleges as necessary. I included K through 12 only when most of the research for that practice was conducted at that level, but that studies showed that that method was also being used at the college level. As I was searching, I used words like Hispanic, Latino, HSI, and when available, I focused on results involving CCCs with large populations of Hispanic students. I discovered many journals that aligned well with my topic and focused specifically on Hispanic college students. I used the AI research tool ResearchRabbit. I found it incredibly useful. By the time I started using it, I already had a lot of sources for each practice that I kept in my Zotero reference management tool. ResearchRabbit allowed me to import my sources by topic directly from Zotero, and then I could click on a button to search for similar works. And then I could see a graphic of my sources compared to additional sources from ResearchRabbit. I particularly liked the timeline view because it showed me the study's years so that I could focus on finding additional recent studies highly cited by other articles. The green circles were the studies I had imported, and the blue circles are possibly related studies not already in my list. The larger the circle, the more other studies referenced that source. I was then able to click on those blue circles to read their abstracts and see if the topic was related to mine and could possibly be helpful. If a study was related and useful, I could add it to my sources list in Zotero straight from ResearchRabbit. An absolutely indispensable part of this tool was showing me when I had exhausted the best sources on the subject, and that saved me a lot of wasted time in continuing to hunt for additional sources. While the literature review in my study is 40 pages long, I'm going to give you the short version. So classroom practice were split into 4 primary categories of assessments, experiential learning, inclusive or culturally relevant pedagogy, and scaffolding. I also researched teachers and Hispanic students' perceptions of equity theories and practices. Assessments had the most subcategories with policies on grading, attendance, homework, rubrics, and testing. Grading and attendance had the most research, and this is the reason there are so many more top authors listed for assessments. Each of the authors here were consistently cited by other authors. So this next section will describe the methodology I used for my study and explain some of the reasons for the decisions that I made. I chose a qualitative phenomenological approach because my purpose was to understand human experiences and perceptions. The qualitative design let me look into teachers' intentions for their chosen equity theories and practices. It also let me get more information about the students' perceptions. I chose this approach to capture insights and feelings directly from the teachers and students. I did 1-hour interviews with each participant. I interviewed 3 teachers and then 3 students for each of the teachers for a total of 9 students. I'll talk a little bit more about the coding process a few slides from now, so I'm not going to get into it here. I did hand select the teachers in the study from MSJC's Inclusion, Diversity, Equity, and Accessibility, or IDEA committee, or from the Culturally Responsive Teaching Community of Practice group. I did this because I really wanted teachers who had thought about their classroom practices from an equity perspective. And because the literature indicated that teachers of the same ethnicity as their students hold their students to a higher standard, I wanted at least one Hispanic teacher, one white teacher, and a third teacher of any ethnicity. I was able to achieve that with one Hispanic, one white, and one Iranian. I also wanted to ensure I didn't get all humanities teachers, so I set out to have at least one STEM teacher. I had identified a white male biology teacher through my work with MSJC's Culturally Relevant Teaching Community of Practice group, and he agreed to participate in my study. What I didn't realize was that the Hispanic teacher I'd identified taught math. So that gave me a second STEM teacher and only one humanities teacher, which was fine, just not expected. The students were chosen by their teachers. I asked the teachers to identify Hispanic students in their classes who they would categorize as average students. The purpose for average was to avoid all A students who might be unaffected by different equity practices, but also to avoid students who were failing and might blame their teachers' practices. And finally, in the end, all but one of the students was of Mexican or Mexican American heritage. To increase the validity of my study, as I mentioned, all interviews were recorded and transcribed. I used a Hispanic math teacher with over 35 years of experience teaching in the CCC. He checked the scope and language of my study to make sure that my questions made sense and weren't culturally insensitive. And both this teacher and Dr. Gonzalez checked over the Spanish in the invitation I sent to the students because it was provided in both English and Spanish. And admittedly, my second CCC teacher didn't have anything to correct after Dr. Gonzalez gave me everything, so thank you. So the questions for both groups were very straightforward. Both groups were asked for their definitions of student success. It was important to understand what success is to each person, since the purpose of the study is to identify Hispanic students' perceptions of their teachers' equity-oriented teaching practices and how they feel those teaching practices impact their success. Teachers were also asked for their knowledge and experience with Hispanic cultures and for the classroom practices that they used to increase equity for their students. Students were asked the number of hours that they worked in jobs. This was so that I could gauge outside stressors that might have an impact on their schoolwork and to compare my results to the literature, which indicated that Hispanic students have high rates of working while attending community college. Then I asked the teachers what practices they use. And I asked the students which of their teachers' practices they find helpful or harmful to their success. Interviews were done on Zoom, a phone call, or in person, and all were recorded. I uploaded the audio files to Otter AI, which is a transcription service, and then I uploaded the transcript and audio for each participant to MaxQDA, which is a qualitative study analysis software, and that's where I did the coding and analysis of the results. So each interview was then coded by identifying words and phrases that fit certain keywords. This showed up as highlighting in the transcript. Some phrases matched more than one code at a time, and MaxQDA allowed me to apply as many codes as fit. I found two tools within MaxQDA particularly helpful for analyzing the results. The first was the summary grid. This allowed me to choose specific participant sets and then subsets of codes to see who discussed the various codes and how many times. That's what those numbers represent in that chart. When I clicked on a number in this table, a window opened and showed me all of the comments made by that participant matching that code. The tables you're going to see in the results section of this presentation were created using this method. The second tool I liked was the Code Relations Browser, and this allowed me to go beyond just reporting on who made how many comments and really look at the relationship between the codes. I used Braun and Clark's 6-step thematic approach to analyzing my study data. First, I familiarized myself with the data by reading through the transcripts after they were completed. Then, after I uploaded the audio and transcripts into MaxQDA, I moved on to coding. After that, I used the summary grid to identify the recurring themes in the participants' interviews. I was able to click on the results to see the specific comments to identify if the item had been correctly coded or not. In this stage, I did identify a new theme of scaffolding. That was a topic I hadn't actually come across in my literature review, but it was clearly important to the students. As a result, I added it to the code book and the literature review. And finally, I wrote the report based on the results identified in the summary grid and the code relations browser. Delimitations are factors that are excluded from the research. The interviews were limited to an hour. As a qualitative study, the population was kept small at 12 participants. Only perceptions were studied, not actual outcomes like grades. As a result, the study did not identify whether or not the teacher's practices had a measurable impact on students' grades. And the participants were all from a single community college in Southern California. I also made some basic assumptions as I designed and conducted this study. I assumed that the teachers had thought about their own classroom practices from an equity standpoint. I increased this chance by choosing only teachers from the IDEA Committee or the Culturally Responsive Teaching Community of Practice. I had to assume that Hispanic students would have opinions about their teachers' practices and would be able to discuss them with me. I also assumed the participants would be able and willing to share their thoughts with me. And at the end of each interview, I provided participants with a $30 gift card to thank them for their time and effort spent on my study. The assumption was that providing them with a gift card wouldn't influence them to answer the questions the way they thought I wanted them to. And now for the results of the study. First, here are the demographics of the teachers. I already mentioned the ethnicities and subjects taught, but it's all laid out here per teacher. I had 2 female teachers and 1 male. The experience with equity practices varied. Teacher 1 is extremely experienced on the topic. She leads the MSJC IDEA Committee and has been published on the topic of equitable practices. The other 2 teachers participated in the Culturally Responsive Training Community of Practice, but their experience with equity training is just some brief annual required training. There was also one major surprise for me in my teachers' demographics. As I already mentioned, I didn't expect to have all 3 teachers experienced in the culture. After intentionally selecting 1 white teacher because the literature indicated that white teachers tend to approach their minority students from a deficit perspective, as in assuming minority students lack something that the teacher has to give them, while teachers experienced with the culture tend to hold their students to a higher standard. All 3 of the teachers had extensive experience with Mexican or Mexican American cultures. The Iranian teacher came to the US as a young child. Her family moved to a primarily Hispanic area, and she learned American culture through the lens of Mexican American culture. My white teacher also grew up in a primarily Hispanic area. He attended a bilingual program through 3rd grade, but continued taking Spanish language classes after that bilingual program was cut. And he also has family who's lived in Mexico for the past 40 years, and he continues to visit frequently. While it's not entirely unexpected to have this kind of result in Southern California, it's still not so common that I could have predicted the level to which all 3 of my teachers had deep experience with Hispanic culture. My students were all female, and this wasn't intentional. I accepted the first 3 students per teacher who sent back the consent form. I contacted male students from the lists I was provided, but each of the first students to respond was female. All of the students were either from Mexico or had Mexican heritage, except 1 who was from El Salvador. While it wasn't a requirement for the study, each student spoke Spanish as their first language. The students' work hours supported the literature review. Only 2 students didn't work. Of those, 1 had recently quit a full-time job to focus on her studies, and the other had quit a part-time job. They had both been finding it difficult to work and focus on their studies, and they both have small children at home as well. Only 1 student worked less than 14 hours per week. She worked 48 hours a month, which averages 12 hours a week, but her actual weekly hours ranged anywhere from 4 to over 20. And the rest of the students ranged all from 20 to 48 hours per week. Before looking at the 3 research questions, there were a couple of base questions I wanted to answer first. The first was to identify the teacher's definitions of equity. In this table and the tables you'll see on other results slides, the numbers represent the number of times a participant mentioned that specific code. This could either be a word or an entire phrase. So for example, with individual success, teacher 1 mentioned that code once, teacher 2 mentioned it 3 times. And speaking of which, as you can see, individual success was mentioned by all 3 teachers. 2 of the 3 talked about providing the right tools to each student, and only one teacher, teacher 1, mentioned institutional barriers in her answer. The next base question I asked both the teachers and the students. I asked for their definitions of student success. Both teachers and students highly emphasized understanding and acquiring new knowledge. In both cases, they included those topics as their numbers 1 and 2. Another interesting result was that all 3 teachers specifically said good grades are not required for student success, while 2 of the students said that they feel they are. So now let's get to the research questions. This slide addresses research question 1, which asks which practices teachers chose to improve equity in their classrooms. There were enough areas of agreement between the teachers, I chose to only look closer at the topics that all 3 teachers mentioned. And that's what the column labeled areas of agreement means. A diamond in that column means that code was discussed by all 3 teachers. So the first was fostering a sense of belonging. This meant actions the teacher took to help students feel like they're valued members of the class and have something to share. The next was open communication. This mainly meant the students felt comfortable reaching out to the teachers for help, but it also included the open communication between the students. As you're going to see, flexible late policies were a recurring theme with both the teachers and the students. This was always based on a recognition of the students having various outside stressors. All 3 teachers discussed having high standards for their students, and this fit the literature review that indicated that teachers with a deep understanding of the cultures of their students tend to hold those students to higher standards than those who don't. And in this case, all 3 teachers had that deep understanding, and all 3 specifically mentioned having high standards as an element of their equitable practices. The literature review also discussed the importance of cooperative learning to Hispanic students, and the teachers all brought that topic up as well. The last subject discussed by all 3 teachers was offering extra credit. Interestingly, extra credit was only mentioned in the literature review by Feldman's Grading for Equity, and he emphasized that extra credit should not be offered because it typically takes away from focusing on the learning objectives. Here, all 3 teachers discussed using it in different ways. Teacher 1 and 2 offer extra credit as a way to make up for missing work, while teacher 3 used it to incentivize students to do the exam reviews if she noticed that not everybody was doing it. Now let's take a look at the students' answers to the questions of what practices their teachers use that either help or harm their success. This answers research question 2, which is focused on the students' perceptions of their teachers' practices. To qualify as an area of agreement, more than half the students needed to talk about the topic. So 5 or more students. There were 6 main topics that fit this requirement. Scaffolding was the topic with the most student responses. It was not talked about on the previous slide because only 2 of the 3 teachers discussed scaffolding in their interview. All but 1 of the 9 students discussed it, though. The students appreciated their teachers' step-by-step learning processes that progressively build their skills so that it prepares them for more advanced assignments. Late policies was the second most talked about topic for the students. The students liked when their teachers allowed them to turn in late work. In each case, the students discussed times when they were prevented by life circumstances from turning in an assignment on time. and they appreciated when their teachers showed understanding and allowed them to turn things in late, at least for partial credit, so that the impact of a 0 didn't torpedo their grades. Fostering a sense of belonging came next, and this was a topic that wasn't originally coded with sub-themes, but 3 sub-themes emerged while coding the students' responses. The sub-themes were personalized support, bringing real-world examples into the learning, and finally, peer interaction and community building. The students really liked their teachers' use of visual aids and technology support, especially the students who struggled with language barriers. Lecture videos and sample problems posted online were discussed frequently, but some negative comments did come up on this topic, like when a teacher walked away from the microphone during a video of an in-person class, and the student who was using that video for review couldn't hear him until he came back. The students had a variety of opinions on cooperative learning. In general, they appreciate cooperative learning and like the interaction and active engagement that it provides. The students really liked open communication with their teachers. Being able to get answers to their questions and extra help were the examples that they gave. I talked about the code relations browser earlier in the methodology section, but now I'll talk about the results. So I ran the CRB on the students' responses to see which codes were related. The CRB works by putting the codes in a matrix. With the code system in both the rows and the columns, it compares interview phrases that were coded with more than one code. It points out how frequently this occurs across all of the interviews. The more interviews that have phrases with the same set of codes, the larger the squares in the matrix. Using this tool, it became clear that fostering a sense of belonging was linked to both inclusive and culturally relevant pedagogy and to open communication. So an example quote was, "She uses materials that have diverse voices, so it offers a different perspective. But again, I think that helps me feel included." Another quote was about how the students always message each other because they have formed a community. The second set was scaffolding and clear requirements. This was highlighted by students who commented on how the scaffolding provided by the teacher made it clear how each step built on the next and what the requirements were. Finally, the results for research question 3, which discusses the area of alignment and disagreement between the teachers and their students. So these next 2 slides compare the teachers' responses to their students and look for areas of agreement and disagreement. At this point, I've already described a lot of what the teachers and students had to say on these codes. So to avoid getting redundant, I'm only going to talk about the ones that I've got something specific to bring up. So remember, teacher 1 is an English teacher. Cooperative learning was a major topic in her classroom. She has students doing peer reviews using in-class discussions and other collaborative assignments. Generally, the students really appreciate the collaborative nature of the assignments and the community that they develop as a result. But as you can see from all 3 students, they also commented negatively on aspects of cooperative learning. There was some disagreement with the teacher on this topic. So students commented that they wished some of the longer discussions were reined in a bit and mentioned that sometimes arguments can get a little too heated. Because inclusive and culturally relevant pedagogy was only an important topic for 2 of the teachers and 4 of the students, that code didn't meet the inclusion criteria for questions 1 or 2 on the previous slides. But the 2 teachers who emphasized inclusive content in their classrooms were also the ones who had the 4 students that commented on its positive impact on their success. As a result, they did make the list for agreement for teacher 1 on this slide and teacher 2 on the next slide. Teacher 1 intentionally includes diverse voices in the reading selections for her class. She feels it's important for students to see themselves reflected in the material. The students recognized and appreciated her efforts. She discussed her detailed feedback, and the students said that it helped them improve their writing and their critical thinking. Teacher 1 has the most flexible late policies of all of the teachers. She referred to her due dates as suggestions for keeping the students on track to complete everything by the end of the semester. One student of hers had a major life event that put her behind by, I think it was 2 weeks, but she was able to finish that class and still do well. Teacher 2 had 4 codes discussed by him and at least 2 of his students. He really focuses on bringing students' cultures into his classroom. He also makes sure that they know they are capable and can handle the rigors of his class. And this was the only item with unanimous student agreement. Teacher 2 was the strictest teacher for late work. In the beginning of our interview, he indicated he has a no tolerance policy for late work. Teacher 2 said, "This is the adult world with adult consequences." But later in the interview, it also became clear that he actually does allow late work based on his students' circumstances, just not for his labs. And that's because he teaches microbiology, and some of his labs take days to set up. He also talked about how he offers extra credit to let students make up points from missing assignments. He did have one student who talked about liking his flexible late policies, but because it was only one student, it didn't make the cut for being included here. His strict late policies were the one area his students indicated that they disagreed with him. One student said that while she understands his policy because it's designed to keep students on track, she still wishes he recognized how hard she was working. She wishes that he would allow her to earn some of the points if she turns it in a day late. Teacher 2 particularly emphasized in his interview how he brings students' cultures into his class. Sorry. I got ahead of myself. Let me go back. There we go. So teacher 2 particularly emphasized that he brings those students' cultures into his class to make that material more relevant. And this was recognized and liked by his students. Now we're ready for teacher 3. So teacher 3 was the math teacher, and she spends a lot of time creating videos and sample problems so that her students can understand the concepts and the steps. And this was mentioned by all 3 of her students as a positive. Teacher 3 is extremely available to her students. She gives them her cell phone number to text if they need her faster than contacting her through Canvas email. And this is in addition to her office hours. Her students recognize that she doesn't have to do that, and they really appreciated that availability. And with that, all 3 research questions were answered. So now let's review the key findings of the study. So looking back at the 6 topics mentioned by all 3 of the teachers on what practices they chose, and comparing those to the 6 topics mentioned by over half of the students about which practices their teachers used that they felt contributed to their success, there were 3 codes mentioned by both groups, and they were flexible late policies, open communication, and cooperative learning. When looking back at the areas of agreement and disagreement between the teachers and their students, a few trends emerged. Students overwhelmingly appreciated scaffolding in their lessons so that they have a better chance of learning and understanding the material. Teacher 1 and 3 discussed scaffolding. While teacher 2 didn't bring up scaffolding as one of his equity practices, it was clear that he does use it because 2 of his 3 students appreciated his scaffolding techniques and said that they were helpful to their success. Inclusive and culturally relevant teaching methods were discussed by teachers 1 and 2, along with their students. Both of these teachers emphasized this aspect of their equity practices, and their students said they agreed. Teachers 1 and 2 also discussed the importance of fostering a sense of belonging in class, which the students said was helpful. Late policies were discussed by all 3 teachers and the majority of their students. Flexible late policies were appreciated by the students, while disagreement came in with the strict late policies, which students said were harmful to their success. Open communication between the teachers and students was emphasized by teachers 2 and 3, and their students agreed open communication helps their success. Limitations emerged during the study. All but one student was of Mexican heritage. It was also Mexican culture that the teachers were most familiar with. As a result, this study is most applicable to Mexican American students and may not represent other Hispanic cultures. And all of my teachers were most familiar with Mexican culture. Also, all the students were women. Male students' voices might have provided a different perspective. This study emphasized the importance for teachers to adopt methods like scaffolding, open communication, fostering a sense of belonging, and using culturally relevant curricula, which Hispanic students at MSJC indicate are effective at improving their success. Faculty at MSJC will be provided with training opportunities on culturally inclusive teaching starting in 2024. That's because MSJC is currently developing this training through the culturally relevant training community of practice. The study results also indicated MSJC teachers should set flexible attendance and late work policies whenever possible, because their Hispanic students are often balancing work, personal, and family requirements in addition to their courses. To build on the results of this study, I recommend a transition to quantitative research so that you can gather results from a larger sample. I also recommend expanding the research to analyze students' answers based on whether they are full-time or part-time students, what their work commitments and family responsibilities are, and also to include a variety of different ages to see if age is a factor in their responses. It would also be helpful to include a wider range of Hispanic cultures and to include male students. This would allow the study to be generalized better to Hispanic community college students. So one of the things that really struck me during this study was how positive the students were about the teaching methods of all three of these teachers. In general, the students struggled to ID practices that their teachers were using that harmed their success. All three teachers received comments from their students about how they're the best teacher that student has ever had. The teachers really put a lot of thought into the practices they chose to improve equity in their classes, and the students responded very well to that effort. The 6 items here on the screen are the 6 practices their teachers use that Hispanic students indicated had the biggest impact on their success. I'm pleased that MSJC is developing that culturally relevant teaching methods course so that the faculty can use that information to become more supportive and inclusive and set up better environments for their students. And finally, taking the results of the study and pivoting to expand them to intentionally include men, additional Hispanic cultures, and more participants in general through a quantitative study would give more breadth to the subject. And that concludes my presentation. So thank you all very much, and I'll happily take your questions now.
Okay, Debbie, that was amazing. Wonderful presentation, very meaningful research study that you conducted. I will hand over the floor to Dr. Gonzalez for comments that she might have.
Thank you, Dr. Norman, and I concur 100%. Debbie did a wonderful job, and it was a pleasure to accompany you, Debbie, in this discovery that connected, personally speaking, on a more personal level, as you know. So I appreciate your understanding, your efforts in understanding a culture that is sometimes misunderstood. Would you like me to pose a few questions, Dr. Norman, or you want to?
Sure, and then I'll ask a few. Go ahead.
Thank you. So Debbie, in the dissertation, you highlight various classroom practices like cooperative learning and open communication, perceived to be beneficial for students of Latino descent. From your perspective, which of these practices do you find most impactful for your learning and success, and why do you think they are effective?
For the learning, I think it was probably the culturally inclusive practices. That was something that was mentioned heavily by 2 of the 3 teachers. Ironically, not the Hispanic teacher, although that's probably because she was the math teacher and a little less likely to bring culture into statistics. She may have, she just didn't talk about it. But the other two teachers really emphasized and gave me lots of stories about how they included the students' cultures. And it became pretty clear that the students recognized it and it resonated with them because they really talked about how they felt included and accepted and part of the class. And I think that that wound up being extremely helpful. The late policies were clearly a major factor, but I don't necessarily think of that in terms of the learning process, more of the success in class so that a 0 doesn't have an outsized impact on their grade.
And one more, if I may, Dr. Norman, and
Mhm.
then, thank you. And so it also discusses the dissertation about alignment or lack of their alignment between faculty and students' perceptions of these classroom practices as we have discussed. How do your own experience align with these findings, and what additional practices or changes do you think could further enhance the educational experience of Latino students at your school?
I'm going to go back to the exact same topics again, the inclusive nature of the classroom. So in my own class, which I teach at MSJC, I only teach business communication. And so communication, of course, is a very important topic, and it includes multicultural communication and the ways in which communication can go wrong if you are lacking any of those aspects of understanding and being able to put yourself in someone else's shoes. And so through my class, we talk about the fact that they all have valuable experiences and I want them to bring them into the classroom, and that everybody else will benefit from their stories. So we do a lot of, here's this idea, here's this topic, now what are your experiences with this? And we do get into a lot of, in my country, we do this, because many of my students are immigrants. So they're not second or third generation, they're first generation. And they bring many experiences, yes, from Mexico, but from many other countries as well. I have a lot of Chinese students, I have people from Brazil, I have Chile, Argentina, etc. And we talk about the differences in cultures, and everybody finds it extremely interesting, and it just generates more conversation. And the students really feel like they're part of this new community that we've formed, and it's great. As far as the late practices, that's not really an issue in my non-credit class, but I do find that I tend to have flexible late policies as much as I can with my Wilmington classes, because for example, I had a student have a car accident last week. I had already said, no problem, let's extend this out. You can make it up by X date. Before I realized she'd sent me a photo of the upside down car. I think she was afraid that I would not accept that she had legitimately been in a car accident. It's just seeing the individual circumstances of students, you realize that you really do need to, within reason, be flexible. And the students are struggling and the students are trying, and it's my job to give them what they need so that by the end of that class, they have learned the material and are able to use that going forward.
Thank you, Debbie. I'm satisfied, Dr. Norman. Thank you.
Okay. Debbie, you mentioned that your college is going to be using training courses. And I was just wondering how specifically you are going to incorporate your insights into that training course.
So as soon as MSJC announced this culturally relevant community of practice group, I signed up for it immediately because that was right along the lines of what I wanted to be involved in. So for a little bit there, I was actually getting paid to do my dissertation research. But we got into a lot of this culturally relevant material. And it was great because it was right around the time that I was adding that to my literature review. And so a lot of what's been, here in my dissertation is in that culturally relevant course that they're currently creating, not because I put it all in there, but because the group did a lot of research on what's helpful, what will help the students to be better and understand better and get this information. So I was adding a lot of this to my dissertation at the same time the course was being created. So it's already kind of like this. So absolutely, when the course comes out, I'm going to take it. Because of the timing, I did not join the portion of this group where they're building the training. I just didn't have time for that. But I'm looking forward to taking the training and making sure that any little pieces that I missed get included in my own classes, not just at MSJC, but also for Wilmington or any other universities I teach for in the future.
And I guess you were kind of surprised by the scaffolding.
I was.
Topic that came up, and that could be because instructors just naturally do that. Do you think that's why it didn't make your initial list, or is this something that, is this a really useful insight?
Well, scaffolding, I mean, I'm sure anyone who goes and does a really quick search for scaffolding in education, there's all kinds of literature on it. I mean, it's everywhere. Scaffolding is absolutely a recognized practice that is helpful to all students. What surprised me was that while specifically searching for practices that are helpful to Hispanic students, nobody was talking about it. I was able to find it after the fact once I went very specifically looking for it. I mean, you can find scaffolding help for Hispanic students once you intentionally look for the word scaffolding and Hispanic students, and then it's there. But if you're just doing a blanket practices for Hispanic students, it was just not on anybody's list. So that's the part that surprises me.
A useful addition to what people are thinking about.
Absolutely. So once the students talked about it, I went back, of course, and I added it to the literature review and I added it to the presentation. But it's such a logical method, and it shocked me that I didn't run across it naturally.
Okay, thank you. I'll open it up to Dr. Danley.
Deb, I love that. It was so well done. It was so well presented. And there's so much of that I know we could take away here and incorporate. And it was just really wonderful to hear and see all those insights. And
thank you.
Great job.
And Dr. White, any words from you?
Not sure if you can you hear me?
Yeah. Yes.
Oh, cool. No, just I've gotten to see Deb come a long way. So just congratulations. Really awesome job. Interested in study. And this is work that I'm also passionate about. So I was really happy to join and see your presentation. Congratulations.
Thank you very much.
Okay, opening it up to comments from the audience. Len.
Great job, Debbie. And as someone who's starting to teach next block, this is very helpful information. And I think I might need some scaffolding myself in my first class. But great points there for me to take away. Thank you.
Thanks, Len.
Okay, Chelsea, I think you were up next.
I just wanted to say that Deb has just been one of the classmates I've looked up to since starting in our journey. Her presentations are always beautifully done. She's so articulate. Great job, Deb.
Thanks, Chelsea.
Okay, and Mo.
So they said all the good things, but I just wanted to say the same things. And in addition, Deb has been the most helpful person throughout this program. And it's not a surprise that she was so good at this one too.
Thanks, Mo.
Of course.
Okay, well, Dr. Gonzalez and I have conferred here, and we are delighted to be among the first to congratulate soon-to-be Dr. Deborah Abrams.
Thank you. I'd like to do a quick thank you. I wasn't sure exactly when that comes in, but I want to make sure before anyone drops off that I get that in there.
Go ahead.
All right, so I want to say thank you to some very important people. To my husband, Steve, you've been very patient and supportive for the past 3.5 years. I appreciate you having the faith in me that I could juggle teaching and supporting our kids through high school along with doing this program. David and Beth, I hope I've modeled the dedication and perseverance I've tried to teach you guys over the years. I'm incredibly proud of the Oh yeah, now I'm gonna tear up. I've never done it before. All right, I'm incredibly proud of the understanding and maturity you both showed, making this journey smoother and more meaningful for me. My dad, Glenn Smith, I'm grateful that you could be here today. You have always been my role model. I've spent my life trying to be like you. Hey, Dad, I finally outdid you. My sister, Chris, honestly, there's too much I want to say and not enough time to do it. You've always been so supportive and have always believed in me. Having you in my corner has been so important in this process. Mo, Len, Chelsea, and Laura, named in the order of our defenses. You guys have been with me every step of the way. I never expected to find lifelong friends in an online DBA program. There's no question I would not be defending my dissertation today if I had not had you guys pushing, supporting, and encouraging me. Chelsea, you said we should all defend by April this year to march together in June. It's going to happen, so thank you. Dr. Norman and Dr. Gonzalez, your suggestions and guidance ensured that I stayed on track. Thank you for giving me the freedom to stick with the topic of equity and to do it as qualitative research. I know I had you guys concerned at first, but I really wanted to get into the whys of my research, and you gave me that chance to grow. Dr. Lamar White, for giving me his time and feedback. I knew I wanted to work on a topic of equity, but I wasn't sure what the best path was. His equity knowledge and experience have influenced my dissertation significantly and helped me refine my thinking toward more inclusive research. And finally, to cohort 35, saw Karim in there. You guys are undeniably the best cohort. Your ability to pivot with life's challenges and maintain our collective spirit has been inspiring.
Beautifully said. It takes a village, right?
Definitely.
Okay, well, congratulations again. Fabulous job. Have a wonderful trip. You deserve to, just live it up to the nines while you're there.
Thank you. For anyone who doesn't know, I'm going to London this afternoon.
Well, enjoy that and well-deserved, Debbie. Probably in London, what you need to do is to enjoy a good margarita, even though it's going to be London.
We got to find out how the English do margaritas.
And in case you need some recommendations, I'll be more than happy to provide those right now at any given time. Enjoy. Congratulations.
Thank you very much.
Okay, well, bon voyage. And we'll see you at commencement.
Absolutely. Thank you.